Why did the most powerful democracy end up crumbling? In order to understand how the Republic of Rome ended up falling, we first must understand some of the problems that were surrounding Rome at this time. First of all, if you remember, Rome began as a small group of villages. From those small groups of villages, it grew into a large empire. Like in Athens, democracy worked well on a small scale. But as the empire grew bigger, it became harder and harder for the Senate to control these large areas. You had 300 people trying to control the better part of Western Europe. Now, on top of that, with the size of large armies came an inability to control these areas. When they took over an area, these became the provinces. And the provinces were allowed to kind of rule themselves. These provinces, though, did not feel a real allegiance to Rome. And some of them did no longer wanted to be controlled by Rome, so which led to rebellions. So all of outside of Rome, you have this inability to take care of the land it's conquered. On top of this, those people are having rebellions and starting up wars. So if it's not enough to have the problems on the outside of Rome, Rome internally is having some issues, beginning with the corruption of its senators. The long-standing tradition of democracy in Rome rested on this loyalty to the state. But during this time, personal rivalry and ambition replaced that loyalty to the state. And the senators began taking bribes. They started looking out for themselves. In doing so, they were not really careful on how they voted. And they made decisions by which they put in people into power who were not necessarily great leaders, then who in turn made bad decisions for Rome. So you have the people on the outside of Rome angry, you have a Senate which is corrupt and making poor leadership decisions, and then you have the spread of slavery into an agricultural system. Prior to this, Rome, the patricians and the plebeians could kind of compete with each other, but as soon as the large landowners started bringing slave labor, these small farmers could not compete with the large landowners. So what you start seeing now is these small landowners getting pushed off their land. They're going to go into the cities to look for jobs, but there are no jobs there. So you have high unemployment, which in turn is going to make the plebeian class very angry, because this gap between the rich and the poor is going to start to grow. Mobs begin to riot in Rome itself, demanding that they get bread, demanding that they get land. So you have the outside of Rome rebellion, you have a Senate internally which is becoming corrupt, and you have the plebeian class which is upset, and you have rioting going on within Rome. Now there's going to be some economic changes which is going to be taking place during this time too. Rome, in trying to keep up and trying to take care of its people, starts to print off more currency. This causes inflation, and the Roman currency starts to lose its value. So what is this going to do? Who is this going to make angry? This is making the patrician class angry. And so you end up with the series now of civil wars that's taking place for control of Rome. Because you have people on the outside angry, you have a corrupt Senate, you have a plebeian class that has no jobs, and you have a patrician class which has no money. All this which causes civil wars to take place within Rome. So in this climate of civil war, there becomes a fight and a battle for the power. Julius Caesar sought office of the council itself in about 60 BC, Before this, he had been a general, and he had served as a year as a governor in the area of Spain. The two consuls at the time were Gracchus and Pompey, and they were two generals who ended a very powerful slave revolt, so they were pretty popular with the people. Rather than become involved in a struggle, Caesar convinced Gracchus and Pompey and the Roman Senate to name him a third consul. This partnership of these three rulers is something that's called the First Triumvirate. Now, why does this all matter? Well, so Caesar is a popular consul, but when Caesar's year-long term as a consul ended, the Senate appointed him to be governor of Gaul. They did this in part because Caesar ends up helping Pompey to retain power. Now, he doesn't do this out of just the kindness of his heart, but does this because he expects a reward back in return. So Pompey puts him in charge of Gaul, which was a territory that was the northwest of the Italian peninsula. Caesar, in doing this, becomes very popular because he led a series of campaigns against the Gauls. And so he ends up becoming the most popular man in all of Rome. He is Justin Bieber, Michael Jackson, and Santa Claus all wrapped in one for the Roman people. So in 489 BC, the Senate ordered Caesar to return to Rome, but to leave his army behind. Caesar's not stupid, and he fears that his opponents will destroy him. So he ignored the order and he marched his army back to Rome. He did this because he obviously knew what his doom would be. He'd probably end up being killed by his political enemies if he didn't do this. So Caesar's orders to march his army back clearly told him not to bring his army. Caesar's orders clearly told him not to bring his army across the Rubicon River. When Caesar reached the river, he knew he faced an important decision. Caesar knew that if he obeyed the Senate and disbanded his army, his career would be over. But if he marched his troops across the river, the Senate would order Pompey and his army to retaliate. So what does he do? He defies the Roman order. He goes into Rome, and in doing so takes his army. He stands there at the river and says, "What am I going to do?" He takes it across, and in doing so declares a civil war and invokes a civil war amongst the Romans. He invades Rome. Today, when people say that they're quote-unquote crossing the Rubicon, this is referring to a very significant decision that cannot be undone. And what happens is Caesar is successful because at this time the armies are becoming more loyal to their generals than they are to Rome. Caesar's army seized control of Italy, while Pompey and his army fled to Greece. Pompey then escaped to Egypt with Caesar in pursuit. When Caesar arrived in Egypt, the 10-year-old king of Egypt, Ptolemy XIII, presented Caesar with quite an interesting gift. And this gift was Pompey's head. And it was not attached to his body anymore. Due to all of his military victories, the Roman people admire Caesar as a war hero and a strong leader. And in 46 BC, they elected Caesar dictator of Rome. A dictator, remember, is a ruler with complete control. And Caesar used his powers to make many changes in Rome, oftentimes without even the approval of the Senate.